The Mailbox Server role: addresses, folders, groups, contacts, and resource mailboxes. There are a number of other objects that are related to the Mailbox Server role that we really have to talk about because you are really going to be making use of these once you really bring your Exchange organization into production. Now, these are going to be related to things like address lists, offline address books, things like managed folders and messaging records management, which is a kind of very interesting feature we have in Exchange 2010. We're going to talk about mail contacts and how you can pull in those contacts out of your Active Directory into Exchange, and also how you can create some interesting distribution groups, especially these dynamic distribution groups, which I think you'll find are fairly interesting. And then lastly, we'll talk about these resource mailboxes and how you can create what is essentially a mailbox for a particular room in your business or a particular piece of equipment that generally you use for scheduling that room or scheduling that piece of equipment. Now, at the conclusion of the last nugget, we completed really working with the mailbox databases and built at least one new mailbox in that mailbox database. At this point, we've got more or less a functioning Exchange organization, and we can actually kind of get some more information out of that Exchange organization. You'll see here we're taking a look at the Exchange 2010 organizational health screen, which is here at one of the top nodes here in the Exchange Management Console. The idea with this screen is that it's intended to provide you a single glimpse view, a single pane of glass, if you will, that gives you some information about your databases and your licenses and just some little things about your infrastructure so that you can understand the health of that infrastructure. Now, when you first install that Exchange organization, you're not going to see any information here. As you can see here, all of this information is currently unavailable. The way that we actually go about gathering this information is by over here on the right, collecting that organizational health data. Now, we can do that down over here, or we can do this down here where it says that data is unavailable. Click here to access the latest data. Let's go ahead and click this now. This process of collecting organizational health data is relatively automated. All we really need to do is click that we want to collect it immediately, hit the next button here, and actually let it go through the collection process here. We're going to click the collect button here, and it's going to go through its tasks. Now, once these tasks are complete, we're going to get a little bit of better information about the types of mailboxes and just the count of licenses and things like that are associated with our organization. We click the finish button here. And you'll see here that we have 3 total databases. Don't forget that one of those databases is actually a public folder database. 2 database copies, none that are unhealthy. And then the license summary here shows 2 users requiring CALs. We have standard CALs and enterprise CALs that are required. So again, just a little bit of information here about the data that makes up our organization. Useful for helping you understand what sort of servers do you have out there, what sort of users do you have out there, etc., etc. Now, some of the other topics that we want to talk about in this nugget really relate to, again, those sort of miscellaneous items that we want to think about when it comes with the Mailbox Server role. We really want to start with this concept of address lists. What we want to do first here is move over here to the organization configuration and take a look at the Mailbox Server role stuff once again. We were here already before looking at database management in that last nugget. Now, the first thing we want to take a look at here is the address lists node. And this is, if you're used to Outlook, this is the address list generation that you're used to seeing inside of Outlook. You'll see here we have all groups, all contacts, all rooms, what have you, that are created by default with the installation of Microsoft Exchange. Let's take a look at one of these address lists and just see how it's actually generated. If we right-click and choose the Edit button here, we can actually take a look at this address list and really make some changes to it if we want. Now, normally we're not going to make a change to these default ones out of the box. We would create our own, but what this gives us an idea of is how these filter settings are created so that we can understand how we might actually create our own recipients filter down the road. You'll notice here that the filter that's being used is a PowerShell related equation here where the alias is not equal to $null and the object category is like person and the object class is equal to contact. More or less, we're creating this filter out of a set of PowerShell equations. If we want, we can click the preview button here to take a look at really what is going to be the result of generating this address list. Now, in this case, we're not really generating anything because we don't have any contacts at this point, but this would give us a feeling for whether we've built that PowerShell equation correctly. We can also choose to select the recipient container that we want to apply this filter to. And what this allows us to do is apply this filter not just to the entire domain or multiple domains in the forest, but specific organizational units in that domain. Maybe we want to do it to the user's OU or some other OU that we've created so that we can filter down that address list just however we see fit. If we want here, if we can choose the next button, we can choose when we want to actually apply the address list. Do we want to do so on a scheduled basis? Do we want to do so immediately? What have you? And then finally, again, we choose the next button, and it actually goes through the process of editing that address list. Now, when we want, we can create our own address lists if we want as well by right-clicking and choosing New Address List. What we're doing here is essentially the same process that I showed you by viewing the existing address lists. The only difference is my address list. The only difference here is that what we would have to do is create our own container and also include what sorts of recipient types that we want to do. Essentially create those conditions like we saw with the earlier one that we were reviewing a while ago. Now in this case we can choose again that recipient container. Maybe we want to view just users, for example. And do we want to limit it to all recipient types or specific recipient types in our organization? Let's say all recipient types here and choose the next button. And then we can choose what sort of conditions we want to create that are associated with this address list. Are they in a state or province, a department or company? Do they have certain custom attributes, etc., that are associated with this address list? Once you create these address lists, they're going to be available to your Outlook users, to any application that's making use of Exchange, so that the addresses will be available for people to send email to as they need to. Now, whereas an address list is more or less a dynamic list that's created out of contacts or groups or users or what have you, we also have the need sometimes, depending on the application that we're using for our client application, to have an offline address book, a book of addresses that's available to us when we're not directly attached into our Exchange organization, when we're working offline. That actually address book and the address book generation parameters are configured up here under offline address book. Now again, by default, just with like a lot of these things, a default offline address book is created with the installation of Exchange, and here you can see an example of that. Right now here it's the default offline address book, and its distribution mechanism is web-based. If we take a look at this offline address book, we can actually view the properties of it just to see what the configuration of that offline address book is. Now you'll notice that just like a lot of the other tools that are run on an Exchange server, that offline address book is updated on a schedule, and this schedule is run daily at 5 a.m. so that users will get a new offline address book the next time they connect into the Exchange organization in an online fashion. We also need to identify which address lists are going to be included in that offline address book. Now, by default, when you create an offline address book, it's really just going to give you the entire global address list. So every user that's in the GAL is going to be part of that offline address book. And for most of our organizations, that's probably going to be sufficient for your needs. However, there may be the need to include additional address lists that aren't part of the GAL by clicking this checkbox down here and clicking the Add button. This allows you to take those address lists that we created just a minute ago and pull them into that offline address book so that users can make use of it again as they're offline and not attached into the Exchange organization. Now, in this case, I'm not going to choose this because really I'm just interested, for the most part, in all the users that are part of the global address list. The Distribution tab provides some mechanism for identifying how you're actually going to get that offline address book distributed out to the users in your organization. You can choose whether or not you're going to be using Outlook 98, Service Pack 1, or Service Pack 2, or whether you're going to be using the newer versions of Outlook, and in most of our cases we're going to be using the newer versions of Outlook, 2003 or even 2007. And then how do we want to actually distribute this offline address book to our users? Do we want to do so via the web, using the default website, or do we want to use public folder distribution for that, or do we want to use both of them? Now, depending on how we want to actually get this sent out to our users, we can use one or both of these distribution points for sending out that offline address book. But what this does is essentially, again, provides that mechanism for helping your users with the list of addresses when they're not connected into your Exchange organization. Another topic that you should notice as you peruse the different tabs that are associated with the Mailbox server role are these tabs that are associated with managed folders. We have managed default folders and managed custom folders. Now really these managed folders are the representation of what Exchange refers to as messaging records management. And the idea here is that you may want to create some policies associated with the different folders and the records retention of the data in those folders, not only for the default folders, the ones that you're used to seeing inside of a regular instance of Outlook, but also some custom folders that you may create for your own organization. The idea here with messaging records management is that you probably have a desire or even a compliance regulation that tells you that you have to get rid of data after a certain period of time. Maybe the data that's in your inbox, maybe it needs to be deleted after a year. But you may have the need, your users may have the need for certain types of data that needs to be kept around for a longer than a year period of time, maybe 5 years or 10 years or what have you. And so you may provide the capability for your users to actually have different folders that you pre-position into their client application that will tell the users that they have different policies associated with those folders. Let me explain just a little better. Let's take a look here at the inbox folder here and view the properties of the default folder. Now again, this default folder is a folder that a user is going to see on that client application such as Outlook. Now you'll see here that for this default folder we have the inbox here, and we can display a comment when the folder is viewed in Outlook, and we can disallow users to minimize that comment in Outlook. We can also create, in addition to these standard or default folders, we can create a set of custom folders as well. Let's go through the process of creating a custom folder here. We'll call this our folder where things will stay around. Will stay around a while. So this is a folder that we're going to pre-position on our Outlook clients that users will know, well, this folder, the contents of this folder is going to have a different policy. It's going to have a different set of configurations that are associated to it than the other ones that they're used to seeing, the default ones they're used to seeing. We may want to, for example, set a storage limit for this folder and its subfolders and say, hey, you know what, no more than 1024K in that folder. And we may want to set a comment associated with that folder as well. Put your long-lived stuff here, for example. And we may want to disallow users to minimize that comment if we want. Now, if we hit the New button here, that's going to go through the process of actually creating this new managed custom folder. And this is, again, our folder where we want to put that long-lived stuff in. Now at this point, however, we haven't really done anything with this folder. You know, we've created this folder and we've pre-positioned it into our client application, but we need to actually configure some sort of policy that's associated with what we want to do with the contents of this folder. We do that by going back to the folder that we just created and choosing New Managed Content Settings. Now here's where we're actually going to go through the process of doing the interesting bits with these managed folders. Let's call this My Managed Content Settings here, just to give it a name. And you'll see here that we can give it a message type here and limit effectively the types of content that will go into this particular folder. Now that can be calendar items or inbox items, email items, notes, what have you, or even just all mail content. Let's focus this folder down into email, for example. And what we want to do is limit the length of this retention period to, for example, 365 days. Well, that's about a year. How about 3,650 days? So anything that's in this folder gets stuck around for about 10 years before it gets deleted. That retention period, we have the option of selecting when that retention period is actually going to begin. Is it when it's delivered or when the item is actually moved into that folder? And then what do we want to do at the end of the retention period? Do we want to delete and allow the recovery of that, or move it to the deleted items folder, permanently delete it, what have you? Now this is the way that we can make use of these managed content folders for identifying how long we want this information to stick around, and to allow our users the ability to determine what sorts of stuff they want to get rid of, what sorts of stuff they only need for a small period of time, and then what sorts of stuff they really need to keep around for a long period of time. The other thing we can do with these managed content folders is enable this concept of journaling. Now, journaling very specifically is used when you have some sort of need to keep around items, to keep around Exchange items, Outlook, calendar items, email items, what have you, for a particular purpose. Now, a lot of times this purpose is going to be for the needs of regulatory compliance. Maybe you have some sort of compliance regulation for e-discovery that requires you to send a copy of all of your email items off into some area that can be eventually searched for in the case of a lawsuit. Or maybe you have a compliance regulation that requires you to store things so that your auditors can come through and take a look at it. Well, this managed content settings here allows you from a policy basis to identify where you want to forward copies to. Do you have a particular user or a particular account that you want to forward copies to? Maybe you have set up an administrator account that you want to forward all items that are in this location to another location for archival. Do you want to assign a label to the copy of that message so they can be searched upon later on, again, maybe potentially for e-discovery reasons? And also, do you want to manage the format of that, an Outlook message format or Exchange mapping message format? When we click the next button here, that'll actually apply the managed content settings for this folder and go through and essentially create the assignment of policy associated with the folder. Now you'll see here that once we've completed here, the policy that's assigned to this folder can be viewed by clicking the plus sign here. And as the number of folders that we create gets large, we'll be able to see all the folders and the associated policies for those folders here. Now again, we can assign this policy here to our custom folders, and then we can do the same thing here by assigning policy here back to the inbox. Now we didn't do this before, but if we wanted to create our own inbox policy, we could here as well, and then set our length of retention, for example, down to a year, just like we were talking about in the example before. Again, what this does is it provides you a mechanism to allow your users to identify what is the level of interest or the level of priority associated with the different content that they're creating. Your users, probably greater than you, probably have an idea for what sorts of information they want to keep around for a long period of time or a short period of time, and then also what sorts of information needs to go into that journaling archival state so that it can be used for e-discovery purposes. Now you'll find, however, that as you're creating all of these folder policies, whether they're for default or custom folders, that you may want to actually take a look at assigning different policies to different mailboxes. So let's take a look here how we would actually manage the folder mailbox policies under this node here titled Managed Folder Mailbox Policies. If we right-click and choose New Managed Folder Mailbox Policy, we can create a policy name. We'll just call this My Policy here, and then assign this policy name to any of the folders that we've created here. Let's call it our folder, just like we were creating before. Now that we've got the managed folder mailbox policy, we are assigning effectively a mailbox policy to the folder policy that we created in the previous step. Click the New button here, and it's going to go ahead with that assignment. Now we've got our policy here. We've created this policy that is the linkage between the mailbox folder and then the managed custom folder that we created. The last step in this process is to go down here to the individual user that we want to assign this policy to. Let's say for the Greg Shields user, we need to actually assign this policy. We can do that here under Properties. And under Mailbox Settings here, we can choose Messaging Records Management. We've already been here before in the last nugget, but what we want to take a look at here are the properties of Messaging Records Management so that we can assign that managed folder policy, that managed folder mailbox policy, to this particular user. Now what this does is this creates the linkage from user to mailbox and then mailbox to managed folder policy all the way through the entire thread. It seems like a lot of extra steps, but what this provides is the level of granularity you're going to need, because you may find that different users have different needs for different managed mailbox folders. And this provides you that level of granularity so that you can do all of these things based off of the needs of your users. Now that we're down here in the recipient configuration node, this highlights a couple of the additional things that we want to take a look at that are associated with the different types of ways that you're going to interact with different users. Now those can be distribution groups. This can be groups of users that you create for distributing mail, and those can also be external contacts that you create through a mail contact. Let's start by talking about these mail contacts first. Now first and foremost, the contacts that you have inside of your Active Directory are really the records that you have for external individuals. They can include things like their phone number. They can include things like their email address or their physical address. If I flip back here to the Active Directory Users and Computers node and take a look at the Users OU, you'll see that we have a contact here for our old friend Steve Ballmer over at Microsoft. Now this contact gives us a little bit of information about Steve. Maybe it's got his description or his office or his telephone number, or maybe it's even got his email, sballmer@microsoft.com, one assumes. Again, telephone information, address information, the things that are associated with this person record, so that we essentially have it available in our Active Directory for use by our users. Now if we click OK here, we're assigning that user, that email address to that particular username, but we need to actually pull this information out of Active Directory and bring it into our Exchange organization so it can be used by our clients that we connect into Exchange, such as Outlook. Now one of the ways we can do that here is by right-clicking Mail Content and creating a new mail contact. You'll see here when we create that new mail contact, we can either just simply create a new contact, or we can pull in an existing contact that we have from our Active Directory. Here's old Steve Ballmer. I'm going to click the OK button here and choose Next. And you'll see here's the contact information that we have. This Steve Ballmer, here's his name. If there's any alias here, for example, we can do that here. Maybe we'll say Steve_Ballmer. And then also the external email address. Here we can use an SMTP address or a custom address. In this case, I'll put sballmer@microsoft.com. Microsoft.com here and choose the OK button. And this will link this person's email address with their alias Steve_Ballmer. If I click the next button, that'll actually create that mail contact. And now users inside of our Exchange organization will be able to use this alias to identify and then ultimately send a mail to Steve Ballmer. Really handy use of the existing contacts you already have in your Active Directory, or even creating new contacts in your Active Directory for the people outside of your organization that you would email or that your users would email on a regular period of time. In the management tasks associated with Exchange, you may find that you're going to be creating a lot of these mail contacts over time. Now, there comes the time sometimes when you need to actually send out a big email blast. Like you need to send out a note to all the users in the office that that Friday is going to be a day off because it's a holiday. Or maybe you just need to send an email blast out to the marketing department to let them know of the meeting that's coming up. In Exchange and in the clients that connect to Exchange like Outlook, the ways that you do that is through the creation of a distribution group. Let's actually create one of these distribution groups now. We would start this process by right-clicking Distribution Group and choosing to create a new distribution group. But before we actually go there, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about these different groups that we would create inside of the Exchange Management Console. Recall that there are lots of different types of groups we can create in our Active Directory. We can create security groups, we can create distribution groups. Those groups can be domain local groups, they can be global groups, they can even be universal groups. If I right-click on an organizational unit here and choose to create a new group, again, inside of Active Directory users and computers, I'm back here in my Active Directory now, I can actually create a group if I want. Here are the different group scopes and different group types. Let me go ahead and create a universal distribution group. Now remember, a universal distribution group is one that's used for the sending out of email and is universal, which means it has nothing to do with the domain, it has more to do with the entire forest. Now what I want to do is actually create a group name here. I'll call it Finance Users and make this group available as, again, a universal distribution group. This creates that group inside of Active Directory, but what we need to do is pull this group into Exchange so that Exchange can actually make use of this distribution group. Now at this point, here's why I want to go through and right-click to choose to create a new distribution group. Now in this case, you'll see here I can create a new group. I could have done this all from within the wizard, or I can use an existing group that's part of my Active Directory. Here I have that universal group Finance Users that I created. If I choose the next button here, it will actually pull this information into Exchange and allow me to create an alias associated with the Finance Users. Maybe I'll just do Finance_Users as my alias. Choose the next button and we actually create that new distribution group, and our users will be able to now use the Finance Users alias and display name to send emails out to the Finance Users. Just like with mail contacts, you'll find yourself creating these distribution groups as a daily function of your common Exchange management. You'll be doing this quite a bit. Now, these finance users, obviously the users that are in that group inside of Active Directory are going to be the ones that receive the email when it's sent out. But this is sort of a static way of actually creating these groups. You may want to create groups in a more dynamic way that doesn't have to do with which users are in what groups, but maybe what are the characteristics associated with certain users. We can do that here by creating what is called a dynamic distribution group. Now, different from a regular distribution group is that instead of, again, dealing with the users in this group, we can instead set characteristics that we want to base this group membership on. I'm going to specify an organizational unit here. I'm going to set this to the users OU, and we're just going to call this our group, for example, and give it an alias our group, RGROUP, if I can spell, and choose the next button. Now at this point, you're used to seeing this filter settings menu before. Just like before, we can choose users with Exchange mailboxes, or we can set it to resource mailboxes, or whatever sort of filter we want to put on that, and then apply different conditions associated with this distribution group. Now let's say we want to assign just those users that are in fact in Colorado. We can create that distribution group simply for those users who happen to be in the Colorado state. Now this is going to be based obviously on the characteristics that are applied to their Active Directory information, that information that's published in there. So it's got to be in those records for us to be able to pull this into a dynamic distribution group. But if you have good, well-formed data in your Active Directory, then you're going to be able to easily create these dynamic distribution groups. Choose the next button and we create the new group, and now we have a group that is going to be dynamically created as it's needed for at the point that users are actually using it to send mail. The last topic we have to talk about in this nugget has to do with the different types of mailboxes that aren't directly associated with a particular user. In the last nugget, we actually created the Greg Shields mailbox here and assigned it to the user account G Shields. But this is again a mailbox that is associated with a particular user. There's a linkage between the user and the mailbox. But sometimes we have certain mailboxes that we want to create that don't really link specifically to a particular user. Those mailboxes can be associated, for example, with a room in our environment, a conference room, for example, or a piece of equipment in our environment. Typically, these sorts of mailboxes are created so that we can use the calendaring function of that mailbox to schedule the use of the room or the piece of equipment. When you create these mailboxes, it does actually create a user account associated with the mailbox, but that user account is disabled, and so it's not going to be a user account that you're going to be using for logging into your domain. But that user account is there so that you can create a mailbox associated with a room or the piece of equipment. Let's create a conference room mailbox here just to see how it looks. Now in this case, we would need to create a new user associated with this conference room mailbox. Now we could call this conference room A, for example, that's associated with the first name, and we give it a name here, and then we give it a user logon name, conf room A, and then a password associated with that as well. Again, this is necessary for the creation of the account. If we choose the next button here, we can choose some mailbox settings. We'll call this conference room A. And then just like before, we can specify a mailbox database, just like we did before when we were creating user mailboxes. We can set a managed folder mailbox policy, just like we did before with the My policy that we created before, and even Exchange ActiveSync mailbox policy if we want to. If we choose the next button, we can select archive settings for this account, just like we did with regular mailboxes, and then eventually create that conference room mailbox. Now again, creating this mailbox is creating one that's not intended to be used by a specific user. Instead of being used by that user, the users can then be granted the permissions to modify the calendar that's associated with the conference room. Now that we've created the conference room mailbox, we need to identify some of the characteristics of that conference room mailbox. We do that by viewing the properties of that conference room mailbox. Now, you'll notice here that when we're looking at the properties of this conference room mailbox, there are some different properties here than what we saw with a traditional user mailbox. We still have the same user information tab, address, phone information tab here. However, different is that the address, I guess I should say the intent of the address information here is that this relates to, for example, that conference room and not a particular user. This can be the organization that's responsible for that conference room, for example. Once we've identified kind of what the characteristics are of that conference room, then we need to go and identify what sorts of features and what sorts of resources we want to associate with this conference room mailbox. Now here the features are just like the ones you're used to seeing. Do we want to provide unified messaging, MAPI, POP3, the different types of elements that we're used to associating with the mailbox. More interesting, however, is what the capacity of that resource is going to be. How many people can use the conference room? How many items of equipment do we have? Are there additional custom properties associated with that piece of equipment that may change how we actually book that conference room or how we actually make use of that piece of equipment? Under policy, we can also identify how we want to schedule that resource mailbox. Do we want to allow conflicting meeting requests? For example, is this a PTO calendar as opposed to a conference room? In a PTO calendar, we want to allow multiple people to send meeting requests at the same periods of time. On the other hand, in a conference room, you wouldn't want two people to schedule over each other when it comes to the use of the conference room. Do we want to allow repeating meetings or scheduling during work hours? Or do we want to identify what the booking windows are, for example, or the maximum duration for use? We can also, if we want, identify a specific delegate of this mailbox or a person who is ultimately in charge of this mailbox. This person would be the person who would, for example, identify and approve whether or not your request for the meeting room was actually approved or not, or whether your request for time off on the PTO calendar was approved or not. This is the reason why we would create this delegates here to identify what sort of person is actually going to be responsible for this resource. Down here under resource information, we can also identify just the other items that are going to be visible on that resources calendar, and also what the appropriate response is going to be whenever this resource is ultimately scheduled. Now, there are going to be times when people are going to attempt to schedule this resource according to the policy and then out of that policy. Certain users are going to have the ability to schedule the resource according to the policy that you've set, whereas other users are going to have the ability to do so outside of that policy. Perhaps if you're the CEO of the company, you can schedule the use of that conference room whenever you want without any restrictions. Now, here in the in-policy request, we'll identify which users are allowed to submit in-policy meeting requests that are automatically approved. Down here on the bottom, we can specify those users that are allowed to submit in-policy meeting requests that must be approved by that Mailboxes delegate down here on the bottom. Also, we can identify which users we don't really have to care about the policy and can do whatever they want with that resource. That's identified here with the out-of-policy requests. When you create that resource mailbox, you're going to have to go through and identify what the characteristics are of that resource so you can identify really why is that resource being created in the first place. So what have we talked about in this nugget? We've really talked about, as I said before, kind of the miscellaneous topics when it comes to the mailbox server role. We focused in on those things like address lists and offline address books. We talked about managed folders and the whole concept of managed folder policy and messaging management. We talked about mail contacts and distribution lists and how you can actually create those resource mailboxes so you can identify whether your conference rooms or your equipment or your PTO calendars or what have you can be scheduled by other users in your organization.